Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Marinka, where the Russian forces have managed to capture the full 100% part of the city, both the central parts, which happened on the 1st of December, and now the northern outskirts of the city on the 25th of December, and with this, the Russian forces now have 100% control over the city. This has happened over a series of assaults that started on the 13th of December, where they went bit by bit and captured bit by bit. In a couple of days, they managed to capture large parts here in the central parts day by day, and then they captured the industrial zone to the north and the residential area here in the center yesterday, and today they've managed to capture the final parts all the way up to the dam here between the western parts of Marinka and the eastern parts of Novomykhailivka. So with this, the Russian forces now have full control over it, as we see with this video here, where we see a Russian soldier inside a building at the very edge of the city with a Russian division flag. We see that the Russian soldier right here, based on geolocations, this is the area right by the dam, and you can see that there's no buildings left except for that one at the very edge of the city, as everything else is completely razed to the ground. And as we see here, this is the building that he was waving the flag from, and this is the dam area in between. So we see that the Russian forces have been confirmed to have full control over the city. And we also see that there was a video released representing the final battle over this final part, where it showed Ukrainian soldiers fighting in a trench against Russian soldiers storming their positions with drones as support, and the Russian forces ended up winning that battle, allowing them to now have full control over the city on the 25th of December 2023, after years of fighting, or after the Russian forces started attacking it themselves. We then move a bit south to the direction of Novomykhailivka, where we have this geolocated footage here, which shows Ukrainian forces hitting Russian positions here in the gray zone between the Russian positions in the cemetery south of Novomykhailivka and the Ukrainian positions to the north of that. So we see that fighting continues in the outskirts of the city as the Russian forces continues fighting to get a solid foothold within the city. We then move north in the direction of Avdiivka, where there has been some fighting here to the south of Tonenke. So with the Russian forces fighting across the forest line here to the south of Severna and Tonenke, we see that Ukrainian forces are trying to counterattack to regain positions and push the Russian forces beyond the forest lines. As such, we get this geolocated footage here, which shows Ukrainian forces being hit by Russian shells, Russian artillery in the direction of the south of Tonenke here in the front line. We then move further north in the direction of Bakhmut, where a lot of fighting is taking place and some Russian territorial advances. But we start out with some fighting that is taking place to the east of Klishchiivka, where Ukrainian forces still have positions in the forest lines by the railways, and fighting continues in this area where Russian FPV drones and artillery hits Ukrainian positions here to the east of Klishchiivka, as is shown in the geolocated footage here. So with this, we see that the Ukrainian forces are definitely not giving up their locations and positions here by Klishchiivka and are fighting for it till the very end. We then move in the direction of Bakhmut itself, where Russian forces have managed to advance to the west of the city in the direction of Ivanivsk. So here we see continuous Russian efforts to gain further control over the areas and push in the direction of Ivanivsk. They are trying here to achieve success by capturing the forest lines to try and get closer to the city of Ivanivsk here to the west of Bakhmut. There are some areas here in between the two zones where we see that Ukrainian forces have fortifications they have prepared for Russian forces to attack. They have also been conducting counteroffensives to push the Russian advances back, to buy themselves more time, to reinforce their positions, to gain reinforcements in the areas. But we see that the heavy fighting and heavy pressure by the Russian forces allow them to advance nonetheless, as we can see with the recent Russian advances in the direction of Rihorivka as well as Bohdanivka. Within the village of Bohdanivka, the Russian forces continue pressuring the Ukrainian forces to a point where the Russian soldiers are now in a position where they control about 40% of the village. They've been pressuring the Ukrainians in a long time in this section. The fight of Bakhmut started in the spring, and now it ended with the Ukrainians' summer offensive, which ended again here in the fall season, and finally here this winter we got a Russian foothold on the 20th, and now 5 days later fighting continues as the Russians are now in the center of the village and pushing further westwards as they try to gain full control over the area. But it doesn't stop there, as Russian forces have started attacks in the direction of Rihorivka, here to the northwest of Avdiivka, which reiterates and reinforces my idea that the Russians are looking to gain a front line by the canal lines, trying to push in the direction of Chesevyar and trying to gain full control over the villages to the north of Ivanivske to allow them to attack Ivanivske on a broader front, as Ivanivske is the main defensive position of the Ukrainian forces to the east of the canal line, even heavier fortified than Klishchiivka. The Wagner forces failed to take control of or even get a foothold within Ivanivske prior to them being rotated out after the end of the Battle of Bakhmut on the 20th of May, and were pushed back to Klishchiivka, after which the Russian forces were pushed even further back to the railways, rail lines, and forest lines to the north and to the east of Klishchiivka, losing the whole area. And now with the recent Russian attacks in the direction of Klishchiivka and Avdiivka, they are now trying to regain control of them, which then puts Ivanivske on the spotlight again. So we're seeing continuous Russian advances here to the west, and especially in the northern flank of Bakhmut, where we've seen significant amounts of Russian advances, negating all of the Ukrainian gains and more since the start of the Russian offensive after the end of the Ukrainian one. And now we're seeing heavy pressure on Rihorivka and Avdiivka especially. We then move north in the direction of Terny, where here to the northwest of Kremenna, Russian forces continue their offensive operations in the direction of Terny, Yampolivka, and Novosadova, here in the east of the Serbets river line. The recent advances, which took place on the 22nd of December, has been reiterated with this new footage, which has been geolocated to be here at the very western outskirts of the territorial gain of the Russian forces. We see that a Russian assault group went in the direction of Terny, attacking the Ukrainian positions in the first lines, and they were constantly hit by Ukrainian artillery and FPV drones, which is why their advances were limited. But we see the advances nonetheless, and we see continuous efforts by the Russian forces to continue these advances to try and reach the villages here to the east of Serbets River and to continue pressuring the Ukrainian forces in the area. With all of these fighting taking place and territorial advances by the Russian forces, the heaviest fighting is definitely what is taking place in Avdiivka, as we see in this article by The Independent, where they talk with Ukrainian soldiers fighting in Avdiivka. They say that the fighting is very hot right now, as is quoted, and that Ukraine urgently needs more supplies if it is to hold on to the town, never mind win the war as a whole. For the last 5 days, the enemy has been actively using dozens of pieces of equipment, citation aerial. Our military is burning this equipment, almost everything is shut down. I'm guessing he's referring to the FAB 500s and so on. The enemy is pressing from almost 16 directions precisely along the Avdiivka defense line. The Avdiivka coke plant and chemical plant and the Pove direction are the most important for their attacks, and of course the direction of Pervomaiske, Opitne, Vodiane, where they try to enter from the flanks. So we are seeing Russian forces attacking from 16 different directions, ranging from the direction of Stepove to the north of that in the direction of Berdeshi, towards the coke plant here to the north of Avdiivka, in the Dacha areas and waste sorting plant. We also see in the southeastern parts by the waste sorting plant here, water treatment plant, the industrial zones into the residential areas of Avdiivka itself. In the Sarkov-Hutsa area, we see in the direction of the military installation to the south of Avdiivka, and here in the direction of Severne, Tonenke, and so on. With this, we can already count 5 here, 4 here, and 2 here. That is 11 out of the 16. Then there's additional ones among these areas, which easily add up to 16. And in the end, what we see is that there's continuous pressure by the Russian forces onto Ukrainian positions, and suddenly we have 16 different advanced areas. And from all of this, we see that the heaviest fighting is definitely taking place in Avdiivka, And something very important that he talks about is how they are in urgent need of more supplies. He talks about how the most important parts is the shortages of ammunitions, which is the biggest pressure point according to him. The most important thing we need, not only in our direction but in general along the entire line of defense to stop the army of the Russian Federation, is as much ammunition as possible. 155mm caliber ammunition for artillery and more HIMARS are needed, he says, referring to a US-made mobile artillery system. So the Ukrainian forces are trying to face off against this and are requesting what is the most used in this war, which is the MLRS and artillery systems. We're seeing that the most fighting is actually taking place away from the front line and in the back of the front line, where we have artillery units and MLRS units constantly hitting the other side, trying to inflict as many casualties as possible while trying to avoid getting detected and getting hit themselves. And that is ammunition that the Ukrainians are needing, because they are using as much as they can, but in the end they do not receive enough to continue fighting. And despite that, the Russians are actually using more than the Ukrainians are, which means that the Russians are receiving more from their own industry, as well as what they have recently bought from North Korea, allegedly, than what the entire West combined is giving Ukraine. And taking all of that into account, we have this article by CNN. It is an opinion by Matthew Schmidt, who says that there are 3 different options for the end of the war. One where Ukraine managed to recapture more, but not everything, because they consider a new attack by the Ukrainian armed forces on Crimea unlikely, given the depletion of the Ukrainian troops and the risk that Kiev will not receive the necessary weapons on time. He also mentions how the most likely scenario is that there is just a stalemate, it is a ceasefire along the front line, so he calls on Zelensky to negotiate with Russia. And then the final one is a total Russian victory. A total victory for Russia is the scenario where the West stops sending weapons to Ukraine or limits what they send to Ukraine, as we see right now. And that would end up with the Ukrainian army simply being depleted of both ammunition and manpower to deal with the Russian army. And the Russian army will overrun the country and take control of all of it, because in that scenario, the Ukrainians will not be able to defend themselves against the Russians, and Russia would dictate the terms of peace on their own account with the Ukrainian unconditional surrender. And that is the scenario in which no ceasefire is being built right now, while he calls the scenario where the Ukrainians actually have success as unlikely. This shows that Western experts are now in a position where they've given up hope on Ukrainian victory. And this is reflected in the governments, which is why we're seeing constant delay with aid to Ukraine, with a few exceptions like Denmark and Norway, who recently sent large packages to Ukraine. We are also seeing the Netherlands sending F-16s, but the EU as a whole, as well as the United States, have delayed their packages at the very least until January. And from that, we see that the Ukrainians are suffering a lot from these delays, similar to the delays they had in the first place prior to their summer offensive, where they wanted everything by spring, but they ended up having most things by June and everything by August. This is the delays they had suffered through to actually start their offensive, and major issues for their offensive, as well as the lack of many equipments that they want in the future, and which these packages that are proposed don't even cover. So Ukraine is in a position where they do not even get a fraction of what they need to actually win. And that is where I'm going to end off this video. Thank you for watching and have a great day.